Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, is it? This panel is going to deal with the Turkish-Armenian relations, as you know, and perhaps 20 years ago, 15 years ago, talking about Turkish-Armenian relations would have been much easier. For a number of reasons, and because it was much easier to perhaps talk about one monolithic bloc and one general, overarching, powerful position that's often very difficult to change, very difficult to move. And over the past 2 decades, much has changed in this process due to internal dynamics in Turkey, due to external pressure, due to new actors, new voices, civil society within Turkey, the creation of an intellectual space within Turkey and outside, among Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, and other scholars to talk about these issues in ways that challenge the official state narrative. And of course, other political developments and dynamics like the emergence and the increasing political role on the Armenian genocide issue, as well as a number of other issues of the Kurds in Turkey. Of course, on the other hand, you also have a greater voice, greater visibility for Armenians in Turkey, whether that's the Armenian community, although when I say greater visibility for the Armenian community itself, I'm very cautious here because I'm more talking about individuals who have been outspoken and not the community as a whole for understandable reasons. And also the phenomenon referred to as the hidden Armenians, and you know, all other ways in which people try to explain them, talk about them, it's very critical. And these different layers, these different manifestations, these different changes in Turkey have created a much more complicated discussion. So instead of really allowing us, in fact, first of all, making it very difficult to make these broad generalizations, which for anyone, even for people who are really hell-bent on presenting the situation as one monolithic bloc that hasn't changed. It's very difficult to do that. And rightly so. So this panel is going to essentially explore these different facets of the current dynamics. It's going to explore what has changed and what change means, and is change necessarily always in the direction of improvement? Or is it change in the direction of consolidation and or change in the direction of changing the ways but maintaining the core as the same? So we're going to have 4 speakers. Bilgin is going to speak about Kurdish-Armenian relations. Then Marc is going to explore manufacturing denial and how denial works particularly in academia. And then on a related but topic, Ronald is going to discuss, again, academic involvement, engagement with the Turkish-Armenian issues, and his reflections on the current situation. And then Peter is going to talk about the state, the Turkish state, and the way in which it approaches Armenian heritage, Armenian cultural heritage in Turkey, how that is indicative of Turkish politics in recent decades, and in fact, during the entire period of following the genocide. So without further ado, I'd like us to all welcome our 4 speakers, and then we'll begin with speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, it's really great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I spilled coffee on my computer this morning. It's not a good start, right? But so please bear with me. I printed out my old presentations, and it was shocking for me to see that stuff that I said in 2007 and 2008. I can still read. So I will, of course, update it and modify that. And if sometimes I lose track, please bear with me. It's really, for me, a special moment to be here because actually one of the reasons, or my entry in some of the debates, are related a little bit to the conference that happened in 2007. It was still called the Armenians and the Left Conference. I had not attended it, but I read about it in the Armenian weeklies when Peter and Hank, were debating with Khalid Baghdad. And after reading the debate that they had there, it was really well striking to me that a lot of the critiques that Hank was raising as what he was calling the post-genocide imperial domination with regard to Turkish-Armenian relations was very much resonating with what I was observing in the Kurdish-Turkish discussions or intellectual debates. The Kurdish issue too has been denied, was denied for a very long time, and only after when a Kurdish movement emerged in the 1980s, the denial about the very existence of Kurds started to crumble, and by now, I still say prime minister, but we have to say president Erdogan is even using the term Kurdistan, which was pretty much unthinkable. Many people had spent many years in prison before just for uttering this term. So when seeing both this debate that happened there in 2007 year, when Khalid Baghdad got really very much enraged about the critique that was exposed by the criticism that Hank and also Peter had been raising there, I thought, well, this is all good and fine, but why keep still always talking and reaching out to this relationship, this dialogue that is so much determined by this power asymmetry, and why, if they both exist both in the Kurdish and as well as in the Kurdish discussion as well as in the Armenian discussion, why actually not talking to each other, right? And that's prompted me then to write an article 1 year later in the Armenian Weekly, and then the year again the following year as well, where I made a plea basically for a Kurdish-Armenian dialogue or approachment, which I thought has a potential, a much different potential than the Turkish-Armenian discourse and dialogue, as for the reason that it was bearing the potential for an empowering alliance between two groups that have suffered from the denial. Now I have to, of course, say clearly, obviously, the Kurds, several Kurdish tribes in the Kurdish community were perpetrators in 1915. They were not only complicit, but also active agents in the Armenian genocide. Plenty has been written about this, and much more interesting research is also coming out. Yet, what had been overlooked until then, most of the time, was that the Kurds themselves experienced a transition from perpetrator to victims after the founding of the republic. This was an aspect that the more I was talking, or even talks in the Armenian community, realized that that was often just really blinded out and not realized very much. That once the transition from empire to nation state had happened, the Kurds had become a new internal enemy and had suffered from displacement, dispossession, and denial for almost 90 years as well, with the Republic. So my work, my academic research, and also political interest have been mostly with regard to the Kurdish displacement, in the 1990s. Now, Chomsky, for those of you who were here yesterday, he briefly addressed this and talked about how in the 1990s, out of 5,000 villages, 3,400 villages had been evacuated and emptied. Several million Kurds became internally displaced as well as also externally scattered around the Middle East and in Europe. What was interesting that was the very similarity in the politics of denial that happened with regard to this displacement of the 1990s in the Turkish state. That was very much reminiscent also, with regard to the Armenian genocide, right? For more than 10 years, actually, the Turkish government did not accept that mass displacement happened, of the Kurdish population. The numbers were minimized, and it was just said, well, there's an armed conflict, and we had to evacuate for security reason about 300,000 people, while in fact, actually masses, millions of people had been displaced. And it's only in the 2000s in 2002 that the government position started to change and a dialogue was implemented where the issue of internal displacement came then on the political agenda in Turkey at the governmental level because the EU had made it to a very important issue in the course of the EU accession process. So now that in analyzing this change from denial to a policy of regulation is something I then more and more saw that is something that really very much applies also to the discussion with regard to the Armenian genocide. But what was interesting was that in the domestic discussions, these issues were always kept separate, right? So it's one thing that is very visible in the intellectual or political discourse in Turkey is this compartmentalization, right? You have the Armenian question, problem, or issue, or whatever you call it. Then you have the Kurdish issue, problem, or whatever you call it. And you have an Alevi problem. So you have all sorts of nicely sliced problems, which, of course, is not coincidental, but is a continuation of this divide and rule mentality. Imagine all of these, problems would actually unite and, lead a common struggle against that. That would definitely worry the Turkish state very much. So the reflection that the state has an interest of compartmentalization is not very surprising. But what I found always very sad was that this was really also in the intellectual discourse very often present. So in 2005, when for the first time a more critical conference on the fate of Ottoman Armenians was held at Bilgin University, a couple of months later, the very first conference on the Kurdish issue also was held under an academic institution, again at the University. And I was thinking back then, oh great, we have two firsts on the academic realm, and now, of course we're going to give up this thing about locating the Armenian genocide conveniently to the past. That makes it to a feel-good topic for some progressive Turkish progressives to talk about because it's really far away, but it's much more uncomfortable to talk about the Kurdish issue because it happened right during the lifetime. None of the media, everything that the previous panel talked about with regard to the genocide, you can make also for the case of Kurdish displacement in the 1990s when the mass media also did not report at all. And in fact, actually, Chomsky talked about how the displacement of the Iraqi Kurds had become a worldwide issue while the very same displacement at that time did not evoke this consequence or this reaction. So compartmentalization has been a key feature in this in the intellectual debates in Turkey to these topics, and something that I found very problematic is in there the role that intellectuals have been taken up of rather navigating the state out through the mess that denial has created, right? Rather than actually really breaking the discourse and going beyond challenging the state discourse by daring to use terms that the state does not want to. So in that case, for instance, the apology campaign of 2008 that happened was to me such a very indicative moment where the initiators refrained from using the term genocide and explained this that Turkey is not ready for this. Well, what's the role of intellectuals if not actually opening up the space, by positioning yourself instead of taking the sensitivities of the state, the national sensitivities, so much to the account that justice always remains by the side. So I'm going to what I want to address with two examples is how I think that the Kurdish-Armenian discussion and political approachment is different and has actually contributed to some sort of progress or not. We can just debate about that, and then conclude with a second plea, actually, to again really very much put this issue of Kurdish-Armenian relations much more in the center and not discuss it again as part of the Turkish-Armenian reconciliation as it is again here done today, but actually devoting a different attention because the Kurds are getting a much more different role in the Middle East. I mean, we're all following the news. We can safely say that in the past 90 years, the Kurds had never such a moment of empowerment, regional empowerment, than they have now, despite the current news that we're getting both from Syria and Iraq. But putting that aside, to look at the political developments, basically Turkey is right now having a Kurdish belt around its borders, right? And this is going to, for now, to stay. So it does make really sense to think about more strategically and more proactively about how Kurdish-Armenian relations look like or could look like. Maybe just two examples I want to give where I see that this common experience of displacement, denial, and also much lesser to on the Kurdish side, but also to some degree dispossession, does serve a ground that opens up a space for engagement on recognition and acknowledgement that is actually based on justice and not just on feel-good things like empathy and other items which shapes the discussion so much. So one example I think that has been very much ignored in much of the debates is the case of a Kurdish intellectual, Barzamoti is his name, I had written about this earlier, who in 2007, he himself was a political activist who stayed for 11 years in famous Diyarbakir prison. And in 2000, in the beginnings of the 2000s, he finds out that actually the land that his family owns, it's a very large Kurdish tribe in Siirt, in Erbil, that this used to belong to Assyrians. And he tries to track down, tries to find out who actually the actual owners was, and none of the family had survived in 1915. So he then approaches the Assyrian NGO, the Safo Center in Sweden, which does advocacy to recognize the Safo genocide, and reaches out to them and says, I want to give back this land. Right? This was unrightful appropriation, and since we cannot find any heirs of this family, I want to give this to the Safo Center. This was a really milestone, right? It's never happened before that land is being returned voluntarily upon finding out that this does not belong to you. And the final proceedings of this were finalized in 2008, and neither, the Kurdish press nor also the Armenian press reported much widely about this. It could have been such a good, example setter, right? This is one missed moment. But the other point I think that stands really out and shows maybe has given a little bit more meat and indicates where the future could go is probably the example of the Grigor's church in Diyarbakir, in Tikanagar Ahmet, as we can all call it in many different ways. If we compare the renovation of the church to the Ahtamar church, so the Khatchig church in Mamigonian, right? And I did a study about the restoration and the public discourse that accompanied the Ahtamar church from 2001 to 2010. And one thing that you see is that the renovation of this governmentally funded renovation was completely a showcase to show how Turkey is a tolerant nation, and Erdogan himself, when he announced the renovation, at each speech he says, well, with this, the world can see that we do not commit a genocide, right? So you renovate an Armenian church in order to prove that Turkey did not commit genocide. So this was very much the setup of this of the renovation in Khatchig. The name was Turkified. It's a national museum. The property was not given to the patriarch. So basically, it's once a year Armenians can go there and hold a mass and enjoy the many Turkish flags that surround if they want to do so. A very different story is what is happening in Diyarbakir, where the church has been renovated both with funds of the Suny Church Foundation as well as the Kurdish-run municipality of Diyarbakir. First of all, any of you who have visited the church or who have gone to Diyarbakir can see the changing, cityscape, let's say, of Diyarbakir, where you can see Armenian scripts, Armenian writings. There's an effort to change the street names to put also the Armenian names into the signs. The process of renovation was in a constant dialogue between the church foundation as well as the municipality. And at when you watch the YouTube clips of the opening, it's really not difficult to see that a very different atmosphere is there that shows that there are different radars of reception now after their own experience amongst the Kurds of victimization after themselves experiencing displacement, that the call for justice rings a very different bell than if you raise it in amongst Turkish intellectuals, I would say. So of course this process was neither smooth nor perfect either. I'm not telling a rosy picture here, and it's great. That's victims of all of the denial bodies of Turkey, let's unite. But I'm just saying that from 2007, if I look from 2007 until now, many the developments that have been taking place, both not only in Diyarbakir but also within the pro-Kurdish party, the BDP, who have carried the genocide to the parliament, etc., you can see that there are at least, let's say, attempts to call the thing by its name and try to make it to your own part of your own cause. Right? And I think that does promise an important avenue for further thinking, particularly given that now, since 2013, there is now a process that is called a peace process in Turkey between the PKK and the Turkish state. This is a very important political development, given that for 30 years there has been an internal war, basically, in Turkey with regard to the Kurds. So what does the peace process entail for Kurdish-Armenian relations? Or what does it, well, first of all, I should say maybe that this peace process does not come from a paradigmatic shift within the Turkish state, saying, oh, that was really not very nice what we did to the Kurds, so let's change the politics. But it has much more to do with the changing Middle Eastern politics in the region, where the Kurds are being empowered to such a degree that it becomes really difficult to sustain the Kurds as a soft belly in the new foreign policy ambitions that Turkey now has. So how viable can be a peace process that is based on strategic calculations rather than a paradigmatic shift? And I think this is exactly where we all come in, and where the Kurdish-Armenian relations come in, because there's no reason whatsoever why this peace process, right, should not begin from 1915. So far, it has been mostly discussed for the past 50 years, with the atrocities that happened as part of the clashes between the PKK and the Turkish state. But if we're talking about the returnees, the internally displaced, right? If we're talking about the many, why not extending this discussion, right? Why not beginning with 1915 and talking about ways to return for the Kurds who are in the Western policies now, also talking about the return for Armenians and other non-Muslims populations that were dispersed and in this process. So turning this peace process into something else than what is it right now, which is just a maneuvering, it seems, since last year, is related very much to the question, what kind of a future do we want? And this question goes beyond 2015, obviously, right? Because no matter what kind of a moment it displays, 2015, we will still deal with this issue in 2016 and probably also 2025. So what kind of Middle East is that we're envisioning? What kind of a region are we actually envisioning is at the core of the question, could be present the core of an intensified Kurdish-Armenian discussion and relationship. So yes, so to end with that is what I would like to end with is that I don't know to what kind of there's no guarantee that this Kurdish-Armenian dialogue will result in such productive or will continue in the good timid ways that has been going on and result in and really it's that in a new alternative paradigm of reconciliation. But it's certainly one thing that the Turkish state wants to be, so that makes it already a case, try it a little bit harder. And but it's not just which groups talk to each other. It's also, and I have to end on this note, Khatchig, I've already warned you. It's of course also who is talking to whom, and I want to end with a critique about the conference here, where I saw that there are only 2 female presenters. So that it's not so much about if Armenians are talking to Turks or Kurds, but also if there are also more women involved in this process, and it's not just involvement, it's that we talk about progressive politics, it's about leadership.
I didn't get the moderator.
Fine, that's fine.
Thank you, Bilgin. And there will be a question and answer session after the presentation.
Actually, it's not a question, it's kind of continuing what she's saying.
Excuse me?
It's continuing what she's saying.
Again, you'll have the opportunity to do that after the presentation. Thank you. I will now invite Marc.
Thank you. Thank you to Khatchig, thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate, especially in the company of such a distinguished group of panelists. Strictly speaking, I want to thank them for inviting me back, since I had appeared on a similarly themed panel at one of the first Armenians in the Left conferences, as it was then called, in New York in spring of 2006. And to prepare for today, I tried to remember what it was that I said back then, and hoped it wasn't too stupid. Eventually I found my written remarks, but before I did, I located a video of that panel. And once I got over the shock of seeing how different I looked 8 years ago, I found myself agreeing with some of the things I didn't say back then, and disagreeing with a few others. But the most pertinent point I tried to make in 2006, I think, was that the notion that we're facing an implacable conflict with Armenians on one side and Turks on the other, an unbridgeable gulf between, had to be retired. There may have been, and there may still be, conflict and a gulf, but it is not something that can be reduced simply along ethnic lines, in my opinion. I want to focus in my time today primarily on the academic realm. I'm not talking about state-to-state interactions or individual interactions. It must be emphasized that in the past 20 years, thanks to the pioneering, almost superhuman efforts of Taner Akça, first and foremost, and the efforts of the organizers of the series of Watts conferences, including Ronald Suny, and other serious-minded gatherings of scholars of diverse backgrounds, the body of knowledge about the Armenian genocide in general has increased exponentially, and an ever-growing, if still relatively small, number of scholars of a younger and increasingly critical generation from Turkey are taking part in this scholarly explosion. A result is a detectable, but not necessarily irreversible trend towards greater awareness of the Armenian genocide, qua genocide. The quality and the quantity of opportunities for meaningful and substantive scholarly interaction have increased significantly. That's the good news. And in recognition of this fact, the efforts to co-opt such interaction and to advance the cause of denial have also increased. Let me explain by backing up a little bit in time. 2 decades ago, in a book review, a well-known historian wrote with considerable insight that, quote, every hypothesis, interpretation, even fact or event in the contested field of Armeno-Turkish relations has been rendered controversial by paid propagandists and public relations firms hired by the Turkish government, assisted by pseudo-scholars or the unsuspecting. The field of inquiry has thus been structured by denial and prevarication that has forced those who would try to establish a more credible record and to provide explanation to take up a combative stance. The academic divide, then, to whatever extent there is a divide, is not between Armenians and Turks. The divide is between scholars and pseudo-scholars. Note that the author, who perhaps I should mention is our esteemed co-panelist Ronald Suny, did not assert that there was or is a legitimate controversy about the facts of the Armenian genocide. However, many unanswered questions existed then or now about various aspects of it. Nonetheless, legitimate or not, the field of inquiry has been structured by the efforts to create a controversy through denial and prevarication. This is still true today, perhaps even more so, when denial has made inroads within academia and the repercussions go well beyond academia. For example, in December 2013, the European Court of Human Rights found that the 2007 conviction of right-wing Turkish political figure Doğu Perinçek under Switzerland's anti-racism laws for denying the Armenian genocide was a violation of his freedom of expression. The court said that Perinçek, quote, had never questioned the massacres and deportations perpetrated during the years in question, only the legal characterization of those events as genocide. The court thus appeared to find a subtle legal argument in Perinçek's rather unsubtle statement that the Armenian genocide was, quote, an international lie, unquote. The court, quote, doubted that there could be a general consensus as to events such as those at issue here, given that historical research was by definition open to discussion and a matter of debate. The decision is being appealed, but for the time being stands. Part of the significance of this decision is that it appears to be a crowning achievement in the ongoing effort within academia and without academia to attach permanently the words controversial or debatable to the phrase Armenian genocide and to construct a reality in which there can never be a consensus and there will always be a debate over even basic facts about the events of 1915 and in which this history, at least, will never be settled. How it happens nearly a century after the Armenian genocide and in the midst of decades of growth of the scholarship on this genocide that a manufactured controversy is able to provide cover for an august international court to legitimize genocide denial is a long story and not one, obviously, that I have time to pursue here, but I have attempted to do so and am attempting to do so elsewhere. I've tried to show that the strategies being used are not new and they are not unique to Turkish state denial. For example, in 1969, a tobacco company executive, in a memo he never thought would be made public, wrote that, quote, doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. In 1972, the vice president of the industry-run Tobacco Institute described the strategy of, quote, creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. In a 2002 memo, Republican strategist Frank Luntz advised that the scientific debate on global warming, quote, is closing, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. We need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate, unquote. That's the progressive politics part of my thought. In 2011, Taner Akcan related that he had been informed that several years previous, a US-based academic had counseled Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs that little could be gained by trying to confront the Armenian issue directly, and that, quote, the thing we need to do is to dig a ditch in front of all the genocide claims. You need to create doubt by writing scholarly works which will awaken the doubt. These ditch diggers have been busy. A Potemkin village of denialist scholarship has been built, meant to convey the impression of a history whose basic outlines even have yet to be drawn, and over which there is a robust scholarly debate. This scholarship lays claims to engaging in legitimate inquiry while always seeking to forestall any conclusions being drawn, or any consequences arising from such conclusions. This form of academic denial coexists comfortably alongside and sometimes encompasses more traditional modes such as Levan Trebatian talked about, such as blaming Armenians for their own destruction or rationalizing support for Turkey's narrative on the basis of political expediency. But, you might say, it's too bad such work gets published, but no one takes it seriously. At least no serious person takes it seriously. It's nice to think so, but it is naive, I think, and demonstrably incorrect to assume that anyone with two eyes will see such denial for what it is. In the interest of time, one example will have to suffice. Last year, a book was published by Doubleday entitled Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East by Scott Anderson. Not an academic work, but a work of popular history. It was a bestseller, very favorably reviewed, and was shortlisted for a number of book awards. In many ways, it's a good book, and it also happens to have quite a lot in it on the Armenians. I have little doubt that for many people reading the book, and I've spoken to at least one such person, this will be their first exposure to what the author calls, quote, a genocide in the eyes of men. Go to the footnotes and you will read, quote, the most authoritative history on the 1915-16 Armenian tragedy is Louis, the Armenian massacres in Ottoman Turkey, unquote. Gunter Louis' 2005 book, published by the University of Utah Press, stands as something of a watershed in the effort to make denial respectable, and it was the first of a series of publications associated either with Utah or the Turkish Coalition of America, or both. The multifaceted efforts of the Turkish Coalition of America, formed in 2007 with $30 million from a Turkish-American businessman, call for special attention. The TCA is active in congressional outreach on the legal front, such as its unsuccessful 2010 suit against the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and on the academic front. It has made the Legitimate Historical Controversy Project a major focus, funding publications and the activities of the Turkish Studies Project at the University of Utah, and energetically repeating, whenever possible, the existence of a scholarly debate. A section of its website declares, quote, the Ottoman-Armenian tragedy is a genuine historical controversy. Many reputable scholars challenge the conventional, one-sided anti-Turkish narrative and or refrain from alleging the crime of genocide, unquote. It then proceeds to expand on that. The Utah Project has been exceptionally productive, issuing books and organizing conferences on various Ottoman topics, with special care taken to cultivate the debate between what its director, Professor Hakan Yavuz, grandly terms the competing epistemic communities on the Armenian issue. In order to promote the image of this competition, though, it's necessary to have two teams show up. Otherwise, it's not much of a competition. To that end, an increasingly valuable commodity are scholars who, perhaps unwittingly, through their participation in denialist-framed projects, which seek to reduce the genocide thesis to one among many competing narratives, have supplied deniers with what they crave most: interlocutors, legitimacy, and a debate. But since the purpose of the debate is merely to have a debate, participation in a forum that is, as Ron Suny said, structured by denial and prevarication, is a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose proposition for denial. Unfortunately, some of what is presented as dialogue or scholarly exchange is in fact designed to present scholarship and pseudo-scholarship on an equal footing. This is certainly not to argue, and I hope I have not argued, that any forum that includes Armenians and Turks discussing the genocide, under whatever name, is fated to devolve into a fake debate. Nor is it to argue that denial should or can simply be ignored. On the contrary, I think. Academic freedom grants scholars great leeway, and many scholars will side that countenancing denial is a necessary price to pay for this freedom. Academic integrity is also a cherished ideal, though, or ought to be. A challenge that lies before scholars is the need to uphold academic integrity by producing rigorous works that take the phenomenon of denial seriously, without granting the deniers the status of scholars engaged in a legitimate debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You have 5 more minutes that you can use at any time in the future.
I think I just did draw up other
Ron?
Thank you. The title of my talk is The New Turkey and the Issue of Genocide, Armenians in a Progressive Imagination. And what I'm interested in doing is turning the lens away from Turkey, Kurds, and others toward Armenians to think about ourselves and how we might imagine a progressive politics. Now, I don't have to tell this many in this audience that Armenians are people who love to talk about themselves. Now that makes us not so very different from other nationalities, but somehow Armenians seem to take a special pride, require a special amount of attention, and look everywhere for confirmation about how unique, how particular, how extraordinary we really are. Now, as an Armenian, I partake in this form of narcissism as much as anyone else. And yet, as a historian, I'm trying to learn why Armenians have these feelings and ideas about themselves, and why we think of ourselves as a chosen people. Maybe in part, it's because we're not really very sure about who we are, where we came from, what our culture is. Perhaps we actually share a profound unease about our future as Armenians. I often quote Milan Kundera, who said, "A small people can disappear and knows it." And why wouldn't Armenians worry about Armenians? The long past of the Armenians provides mixed lessons of a people under constant threat from larger neighbors, yet able to survive between and within rival imperialisms. I think of Armenians as a people burdened by history, a history sadly that many Armenians do not know very well, and that too provides some anxiety. I was very much appreciative of the remarks by Marc and others that we've now begun, finally in the last decade or so, to learn more about our Armenian history through the chairs, through Watts, which I'll talk about a bit, through the books like Peter's books and others, Akçam, Dadrian, and so forth, so that now there is actually a record. One couldn't, when I started teaching Armenian history in the 1970s, actually find out much unless you went and did the work scrapping away in archives, etc. Today you can find it on the internet, in the media, certainly in scholarly works, and you can find the denialist works, or what I call neo-denialism, as well. Now, we Armenians certainly know in some vague way the form of the story of the Armenians as a people, who effectively were removed from the bulk of their historic homeland, ceased to be of much interest to those who concentrated on the victors, the founders of the Turkish Republic, and the successor states of the Ottoman Empire. We are a people, I would argue, whose history and suffering has been denied, avoided, rejected, erased from the collective memory of much of the world, and we heard that today in the first panel. Now, I'd like to report, and I am a person of the left, we used to say during Soviet times, communist optimist. I'm an optimist. I believe in, I gave myself away, didn't I? Yeah, so anyway, our Marxist left in I'd like to report that the situation has improved in my lifetime. Indeed, more and more Armenians today know something about the past than they did when I was growing up. There are Armenian schools, there are churches, there are public organizations. There's the existence, of course, of the independent Republic of Armenia, a troubled state, certainly, but it helped to bring Armenia and Armenians to the world's attention. Armenian history, I would of course have to say, is still in an infant stage. Soviet and post-Soviet historians in the Armenian Republic itself work under the burden of unscientific traditions, Soviet Marxism, which is hardly Marxism in my view, and now a very fierce ethno-nationalism. In the West, there are too few historians working on Armenian history, and even the important subject of the Armenian genocide has only a handful, if that, of real scholars investigating what happened in 1915 and why. I would argue, first of all, for those who would think of Armenian progressive politics, that the history of Armenians can no longer be conceived largely in national political terms, and primarily directed toward an ethnic audience. It now must be directed, and I think this conference, and indeed last night Chomsky's speech, shows that a broader international and scholarly context, a different kind of audience, needs to be looked at. Armenian historical writing has been narrowly concerned with fostering a positive view of an endangered nationality. Understandable, because we are indeed a besieged nation. Popular writers and activist journalists, both in the diaspora and Armenia, have handed us down an uncritical historical tradition, replete with heroes and villains. One of them was Vasak Suny, but that's all right, okay. And scholars who might otherwise have enriched the national historiography have withdrawn from the field marked by unexamined nationalism and narcissism. In general, Armenians have avoided criticism because it might aid ever-present enemies, and certain kinds of inquiry have been shunned as potential betrayals of the national cause. I remember when I started to try to work out why was there a genocide, not if there was a genocide. I was saying, as Marc mentioned, that we were playing on the field that had been established by the Turkish state, trying to prove there was a genocide. There was a genocide. The question is, why was there a genocide? Well, what is the explanation? And a very prominent historian, who will remain nameless, Richard Hovhannisyan, said to me, Ronald, be careful. If you try to explain the genocide, you may in fact justify the genocide. You may make what the Turks did rational in some sense. And Bilgin and I had a discussion on the way over here when I tried to explain, I'll give a little bit of this later, why I thought there was a genocide. The explanation comes close, but does not imitate or mimic the Turkish denials rhetoric. So this is an important thing. We're now at the stage where we can talk about what actually happened, of course, in its greater detail, and that's very important, and then try to look at why it happened, when it happened, indeed. Let me tell you then a word or two about Watts and what we tried to do for those 12 years, from roughly the late 1990s up through the present time. I'll begin with a little autobiography. I went to Turkey in 1998. I was invited by a graduate student of mine to give a talk. I said, if I come to give a talk at Koç University, I'm going to talk about the Armenian genocide. He said, I don't care if you talk about it. I'm leaving soon anyway. So I decided to go. My mother was very upset, as you can imagine. And I actually turned to Müge and said, my friend Müge Göcek, who's a Turk, a white Turk even from Istanbul, well-established family. I said, Mügecan, can I go? Will it be safe? And she said, oh, Ronald, it'll be fine. If anything happens to you, we can get you out. I gave a talk, and what happened was, this audience, particularly young people, some faculty members walked out, but younger people listened to the talk and asked interesting questions. And it occurred to me, and I think this was a blind spot in my own imagination, I saw there was something, this was not the Soviet Union, this was not a place where civil society had been completely encased by the state. There was civil society in a place like Istanbul, in an English-speaking private university. There was some civil society, there were people to talk to. And so I came back, and Müge, Kemal Production, and others, and eventually Mouradian, formed this group of Watts workshopping Armenian Turkish studies. And we began to organize meetings of Turkish, Kurdish, and other scholars with Armenian scholars. The first thing that happened was Armenian scholars, very prominent ones, this I really won't mention names, refused to come. We won't come and talk to Turks because they denied the genocide. I said, Baba, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to start the dialogue so that we can talk and we can find out what happened in Marc. And some did come, like our dear friend Marc, Kevin, of course, and others. And Turkish scholars came, very prominent people, Ali Kaytan and Archam. I found out quickly most of them were on the left, and most of them had been in jail at some time as terrorists or whatever. But that was okay, that was probably good credentials. They came, we had these meetings, and eventually this led to the Bilgin conference in 2005. Hrant Dink came to our meetings, and other journalists came, and eventually wrote about these things, Hassan Imam and others, in those times. So a dialogue began, and it was extraordinary what happened. Now, Watts cannot take credit alone. You start a little thing, it begins to grow, we're trying to do something academic. But it happened that we hit the zeitgeist, that's a German word. Zeitgeist, we hit the spirit of the time, and at a critical historical conjuncture, when the AKP, Erdogan's party, came to power, and when it decided to use democracy as a weapon, as an instrument, to undermine the Kemalist nationalist state. So Armenian genocide became, in the minds of progressive Turkish intellectuals, the thin edge of the wedge that could begin to change the way people were thinking about things. And we met with these people, they came, and it was extraordinary. And as Adis was telling me this morning, at least among that group, I'm not saying we reach out to a huge public in the country, but things began to change. And that was one extraordinary development. In 2011, I, my wife Armina, and my daughter Anush, who's studying Turkey and Kurdish problems, etc., went out to Eastern Anatolia, to historic Armenia. I went to see Armenia, and what we found was Kurdistan. But everywhere we went, from Kars in the north, to Van, to Bitlis, Diyarbakir, and Mardin, when we talked to Kurds, we found a very consistent discourse. The ordinary people are talking to us, and they're saying basically, we're sorry this happened. We did participate in this, or our grandparents participated in this. The Turks made us do it, a little bit of, letting themselves off the hook. We did this happen, and they began to talk about it as a genocide. I'm not sure they used exactly that word, but certainly they talked in those terms. And I realized, and this was a point that Bilgin was making, there was a shift in, at least among certain Kurds and Kurdish officials, toward an understanding of what had happened and why. Now, there were other problems. The Kurds were living in Armenian houses. We went to see these places. They thought we did very well. We lived well, and that was good. They always asked, where's the gold? But besides those kinds of things, I was really struck by the fact that something was shifting, at least among that part of the population, and this sort of elite, progressive Turkish intelligentsia as well. So where does this leave Armenians? And where does it leave the idea of progressive politics? And I'd like to just conclude with that point. It seems to me that at the beginning of the 21st century, we have new tools and new abilities, new capabilities. One of them is we really can, if we're all interested, learn about our history in ways that we couldn't do 20 years ago. And there's an intellectual presence, even at MIT with Lerna, there's an intellectual presence in major universities throughout the world by Armenians, by non-Armenians, and by Turks. There is a huge new generation of Turks and Kurds coming out of Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, the University of Chicago, the University of Michigan, who know Ottoman, who are writing this history as well. That history, and this is very important for Armenians, is being written in a different way. It's being written in the context of a cosmopolitan, multinational history of the Ottoman Empire, not simply discrete national histories of Armenians over here, as if there's always been a conflict between Armenians and Turks, or Kurds, or whatever. And that kind of history shows that Armenians in those times had much more complex, hybrid identities, abilities to maneuver within an empire in which they were not first-class citizens or first-class subjects, as the case may be, but in which they could actually do pretty well under certain circumstances in a context of tremendous insecurity. And there were alternatives to genocide. And even the young Turks looked at those alternatives, particularly in their early history, ultimately ending up with the most radical and the most vicious solution to their problem of how to survive as an empire, that is the mass murder of one or two Armenians and Syrians of their own subject. So that's the first thing, is we must think of ourselves much more now in a more cosmopolitan, internationalist kind of point of view, which is, of course, part of what progressivism has always been about. And think about the fact that Armenians don't only have a single problem. The genocide, of course, is something, and this conference is about the recognition of genocide. That is important. But there are far more serious problems. The genocide is important, it is symbolic, it is an affective problem, it touches our emotions, it touches our victims. There's a problem with democracy in the Armenian Republic. There's a problem with corruption in the Armenian Republic. These are problems that Armenians don't want to look at. Armenia is occupying lands of its neighbor republic. Armenians think they're Israel, and that they can solve these problems through this kind of occupation. Armenians have a kind of agency at the moment. They're in power in the system. They can be the ones who can negotiate, just as Israelis could in the Palestinian issue. And yet, we're not thinking about that. We must think more about these kinds of issues as well as the genocide. We must support efforts like Adis of Armenians who we had turned our back on in the diaspora, in Turkey. We didn't think about these people until Hrant appeared. And Hrant was criticized until he was murdered. We got to think about the monuments in that area. I think Peter will be talking about that. All of these issues. And we must think about the possible allies we have within Turkey and within the Middle East, the Kurds as well. One last point. I tried, when I was at the Holocaust Museum in the fall, to interest the direction of the administration of the Holocaust Museum in an Armenian conference, in some kind of meeting in 2015 to mark the genocide and I framed it in a way I called it from the Holocaust, from the Armenian genocide to the Holocaust, the origins of modern human rights, because that is what this is about. And they refused. They refused. It's a government agency. They don't want to talk about these things. We're still working on it, but that seems to be, there's another small issue that we can think about. So genocide, obviously important, but let's not limit ourselves, our vision, to a single issue. Thank you.
Wow, so Marc and Ron, they're really shaming me into being economical. Great. We're glad to be here. Thank you for the organizing committee. If I do stand up and begin to talk in the room I talk, it's only because of my back. This could use a little movement here, but I'm going to try to do it sitting down in the form here. But let me just start by saying, just very broadly here, I agree with Ron so much that the change in the state of consciousness, education, discourse, and Marc made the same point, in the last 25 to 30 years is large. And it's been gratifying, you know, if you work in the business of writing and education, it's gratifying to see the way things have evolved, opened up, as Ron noted, especially the cosmopolitan and I hope even in the future kind of post-colonial engagement with Armenian histories as part of many other histories. So I think there's great hopefulness in this, and Ron Watts has had a great impact, and I hope that people understand that dialogue has meant so much to the opening up of things. And yet, you know, there is still an impasse. And as 2015 arrives, there's the presence of the social justice problem, the lack of it, for all the movement in the some spheres of intellectual work and public and civil society work. Some enormous kind of weights hang over the whole impasse in this long and difficult historical aftermath of 1915. What I want to do here, in the next 19 and a half minutes, is to reflect on a couple of chronic issues in the Turkish-Armenian impasse, and I hope that these reflections can be situated in the broader conversation. There's not time here to theorize anything, but we can do that together in conversation. I call my talk today From Baliani to Ani, Turkey's Paranoid Style. And in using the phrase paranoid style, I want to play with Richard Hofstadter's well-known article from 1964. At least I want to play with the rubric from his well-known article. And probably if we had more time, we could really play with paranoid styles and nationalisms because they are prevalent globally. But the paranoid style in American politics, the piece Hofstadter wrote at that point in the early 60s, in which he looked at various extreme conservative movements and moments in American history: federal clerical reaction to the French Revolution, anti-Masonic hysteria of the early 19th century, Protestant nativism in reaction to Catholic influx of immigrants in the 19th century, and of course the McCarthyist hysteria about communism in the 1950s, which was really, I think, the impetus for his writing the piece. In case if you don't, Hofstadter was one of the major American historians of his generation. If he's new to you, you should find out about him, and his work I find still useful. Now, I'm interested in some of the Hofstadter things because his notion that heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy define an idea of a paranoid style, and that the political paranoid sees a conspiratorial world directed against a nation, a culture, and a way of life whose fate affects not himself alone but millions of others. Now we can see how these dynamics still percolate on the American right. The Tea Party, for example, strikes me as still a kind of manifestation of this. And I'm going to do something here today, and I know that historically this is a real shortcut, but just permit me this in the time we have. I want to plunk this paranoid style rubric down into the Turkish-Armenian impasse for a moment and talk about what I see as the Turkish state's obsession with the Armenian people and the genocide of 1915, an obsession that could be called fetishized, I think. And again, I think a comparative perspective here would be valuable. The Turkish state's fetishization of other minority segments of Turkey, Anatolia, and the former Ottoman Empire, the Greeks, the Kurds, for example, the Alawi, all of that would be important comparative analysis. There's no time to do that here today. So I want to focus on our fundamental subject, the Armenian case, and this moment. So my own sense of this fetishizing of the Armenian is that this has in part resulted in state efforts at erasing the representation of the Armenian past in Turkey and the proactive creation of false narratives. You know, fictions and falsifications are always part of extreme nationalism, and we can see this in our own American history in relation to Native Americans and African Americans, although progress has been made there, you know, in the last half century. I think as well, in thinking about this issue, I want to just, again, all too briefly raise one of the perspectives of the sociologist and Holocaust scholar Zygmunt Bauman in his observations about the image of the Jew in Europe and the foundations of anti-Semitism, because I think there's strong resonances here for the image and the idea of the Armenian in the Turkish imaginary and collective imagination and state-driven narrative. Like the Jew in Europe, the Armenian in Turkey was, and in some context still is, and I know I've experienced this personally, and some of you may have as well, is still associated with money, wealth, an alien religion, modernity, Western education, bourgeois economy, European political ideas. Armenians were, in many significant ways, a tainted and targeted, ultimately dehumanized ethnic group that was turned into an abstraction or a cartoon, salient dimensions of all institutionalized racism and bigotry. Now, the social psychological orientation of this is in part what I see as at the root of what I call the Armenian erasure syndrome. Not eraser, but erasure syndrome. And there are many layers to this erasure syndrome. The denialist campaign that Marc talked about concerning the history of the Armenian genocide is one of them. But a lot has been written about that, and it's not my subject today. I want to talk about some dimensions of representation inside Turkey and suggest that they remain ethical impediments to reconciliation or even conversation between the two cultures at higher state levels. One, the Balakians. Now, I also offer the Balakian thing as a rap or a hip-hop song for anybody who wants to work. The Balakian. So tour guides in Istanbul, this is well known, it's been reported to me by other tour guides. I've experienced it, I've heard it. There's been a lot of conversation about this. Tour guides, when they identify many of the major structures of Imperial Ottoman Turkey, tell tourists that these great buildings were built by an Italian family named